Welcome back. My aim in the next several videos is to give you the flavor of what it's like to inhabit these two traditions, Sufism and Phenomenology, not just theoretically, but in a hands-on way. And I want to give you a taste of the approach to meditative practice, consciousness studies, and ethical and psychological work that I've been engaged in with people for decades. Those of you who've been following my collaboration with Adnan Hussein in our Names of God series know that we've been reading a 13th century Sufi book on the names of God, written by one of Ibn al-Arabi's direct students, Afif al-Din Tlemceni. And in the next episode, Adnan and I discuss the next chapter in that book about the name al-Muḥīṭ, the All-Encompassing. So today I'm going to use the name All-Encompassing as a springboard for talking about qualified non-dualism in mystical practice. In the course of upcoming episodes, I'll be mentioning one important 20th century phenomenologist in particular, in addition to Edmund Husserl, and that's Eugen Fink. And I'll also be quoting from the poetry of an important 19th century Akbarian Sufi, Emir Abdul Qadir, who led the Algerian resistance to French colonialism. Since the beginning of this series, I've been describing the Sufism of Ibn al-Arabi as an example of qualified non-dualism. And that's a complex idea. So let's start with the distinction between dualism and non-dualism. By dualism, I mean the view that ultimate reality is fundamentally composed of two distinct kinds of being. For example, God and the world, or spirit and materiality, or self and ultimate reality. These are viewed as inescapably different from each other. And so by non-dualism, I mean the view that at the deepest level, reality is fundamentally one, even if that unity appears as multiplicity in everyday life. So from a dualist perspective, God and humans are always ultimately different and distinct from each other. From a non-dual perspective, even though in everyday experience, we see a world of multiple people, places, and things, and normally experience ourselves as distinct from ultimate reality, nevertheless, that reality actually saturates and encompasses everything that we normally see as seemingly separate and distinct. So dualism versus non-dualism is our first distinction. And the Sufism of Ibn al-Arabi is a non-dual tradition because Ibn Arabi and his inheritors insist on a radical interpretation of Tawheed, of God's oneness. They insist that there is nothing other than him. There is nothing other than him. That's actually a quote from Tlemceni's chapter on the All-Encompassing. Other mystical traditions that many of you will be familiar with, like Advaita Vedānta, Kashmir Shaivism, Mahayana Buddhism, can also be broadly classified as non-dual because they all hold that ultimate reality is one. But the way that those traditions understand non-duality varies in important ways. So, for example, among these non-dual traditions, some hold that not only is ultimate reality one, but moreover, multiplicity is in a really important sense just an illusion or merely an appearance. And that's what I'd call strict non-dualism. Advaita Vedānta is a good example. Meditative awakening from that perspective is said to yield the recognition that there is no true multiplicity. You think you have an individual consciousness, but in reality, there's only one ultimate consciousness, see? There is no distinct you. The mainstream interpretation of the non-self doctrine in Buddhism is another similar case. So a scholar and practitioner of Theravada meditation recently explained that in that tradition, meditation aims at, quote, the first person realization that there is no self. So in contrast, Ibn Arabi's Sufism holds that multiplicity, including the multiplicity of human selves, is real, but that it exists within and depends upon and expresses a deeper underlying unity. And this unity within multiplicity is what scholars like Ninian Smart call qualified non-dualism. It's qualified because the experience of, for example, multiple human selves is not considered just an illusion. So Akbarians claim that this oneness can be verified personally through the spiritual path, and that your personal selfhood is not an illusion, but a real manifestation of that underlying divine oneness. So in this view, you as a human are a locus, a place, a mazhar, where God comes to know himself through you. And interestingly, a somewhat similar claim is made by the Indian mystic and philosopher Rāmānuja in the 12th century. He was a key figure in the Viśiṣṭādvaita Vedānta tradition. So for Rāmānuja, as Ninian Smart, the scholar, wrote, there is, quote, identity in difference between the Lord and his creation. So God is the self underlying these selves, unquote. So one more time. There's an underlying identity in difference between the Lord and his creation. So God is the self, meaning the one unit of self, underlying these selves, meaning the multiplicity of human selves. But feeling an underlying unity with all of creation and an underlying connection with God is not the ordinary human condition, right? So how do the Sufis account for the gap? Ibn Arabi or Tlemceni would claim that the ordinary state of humans is to be basically sleepwalking through life, that for the most part, we don't truly know who we are. In fact, there's a statement that's sometimes attributed to Hazrat Ali that goes like this: man is asleep, when he dies, he wakes up. And Ibn Arabi often mentions this to comment on the need to awaken from living as if asleep. Why? Because from this perspective, absorption in our everyday attachments to our worldly identity and self-absorbed goals are ultimately superficial. In other words, your essential identity is not captured by who you think you are in the usual flow of your everyday life. So on this view, you're largely a stranger to your own essence. And this is actually a critical part of Sufism, and one reason why the practice of meditative remembrance is called dhikr, called remembrance, because we're attempting to counteract a default forgetfulness. And that's both a forgetfulness that's ethical, because it's forgetting what's most important, but also an ontological forgetfulness, because you're asleep to your actual existence. So in other words, in the ordinary attitude of everyday life, you're simultaneously forgetful of God and forgetful of yourself. It's through the meditative path that you loosen your attachment to a kind of tunnel vision, a kind of blinkered, limited sense of who and what you are, and become increasingly able to recognize the reality of what it means to be you, which is far more dynamic than the character you usually take yourself to be in everyday life. So therefore, Ibn al-Arabi often mentions who recognizes themselves recognizes their Lord. Who recognizes themselves recognizes their Lord. Meaning, in part, the person who recognizes their essence recognizes themselves as a place where that oneness is manifesting, while remaining a frail figure, a poor human subject, someone who's subject to the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to, as Shakespeare said. What can the Sufis possibly mean? Well, they mean that there's an underlying encompassing oneness. And encompassing is exactly the divine attribute that Tlemceni is talking about here, that transcends your everyday sense of being bound to the limits of your skin. Now, still, on this view, your individual human selfhood is meaningful. It's just that the boundaries you usually take for granted as marking a strict separation between yourself and God, or yourself and the real, or between yourself and the rest of the cosmos, are not so strict and solid as you think. So, for both Ibn Arabi and Rāmānuja, since you have a meaningful kind of selfhood, you likewise are capable of having a meaningful, worshipful relationship with divinity. And similarly, relationships and negotiations between individual egos, individual people, are not unreal from a qualified non-dual perspective. Yes, you really are here as an individual human. And yes, you really do need to negotiate difficulties with other people. So from this perspective, the problem we face is not that we're deluded into experiencing ourselves as an ego. Remember that the word ego just means I in Greek. It's not that your selfhood is just an illusion. No, instead, the problem is we're typically stuck in egocentrism. Egocentrism means acting as if our little I is the center of the world. And the Sufi idea is the egocentrism is radically remediable, actually, with the right kind of ethical and meditative striving. Which is why so much of Sufism is not about cultivating visionary mystical states. It's actually about ethical development, akhlaq. So this is qualified non-dualism, underlying oneness, and yet there's still an important reality to your selfhood, but radically decentered because the self you usually think you are is not the center of the world. So having said all this, those of you who are well acquainted with strict forms of non-dualism, like most versions of Buddhism or Advaita Vedānta, can see some big differences with the Akbarians. From the Buddhist point of view, liberation is not realizing that yourself at its depth is one with God. It's not about connecting with a God. It's realizing that the self you thought you had was never there in the first place. What remains is not a personal self entering into divine oneness or greater fellowship with other distinct selves. No, but rather a direct realization of emptiness and a compassion that arises, but without a separate someone who possesses it. Much, much more could be said about this, and I hope I have the chance to bring a Buddhist or an Advaitin into the conversation in the future, but I'm going to leave it here for now. In the next episodes, I'm going to turn to Tlemceni's words, to Emir Abdul Qadir's poetry about realizing oneness, and to Fink's phenomenological way of pointing toward the absolute, or in Politilics, theological language, the God above God. See you soon.